I didn't know I was walking into a trap until it was already closing around me like a cage. Mom called me home for Sunday dinner that evening, something that felt safe and normal, something I'd done 100 times before. I arrived at the house around 5 o'clock, removed my shoes in the entryway, and called out to see who was home. I found Dad already in the living room, sitting in his usual chair by the window, the one he'd occupied for the last 15 years. Then my brother appeared from the hallway behind me, cutting off my exit, and I understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't a family meal. This wasn't a casual gathering. This was a courtroom, and I was the defendant. My brother started speaking before I even had a chance to sit down, before I could remove my jacket, before I could even breathe. His voice was calm and measured, almost concerned, the way someone sounds when they're delivering terrible news about a hospital diagnosis. He talked about me like I wasn't there in the room with them, or like I was too damaged to understand my own life. He used words like patterns and reactions and moments of weakness. Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread across the room and into my chest. My parents leaned in closer, absorbing every accusation, nodding slowly. I tried to interrupt, to defend myself, to explain, but my throat closed up completely. The words stuck there, trapped in my chest, and my silence became my guilt in their eyes. He painted a picture of me as unstable, unreliable, difficult, someone who couldn't be trusted with anything important. And they believed every single word without asking a single question. I realized then that I wasn't losing an argument. I was losing my family. My mother finally spoke after what felt like hours of silence, though it was probably only minutes. "We just want peace," she said, her voice soft and tired, as if peace meant my silence. As if my suffering was the price we had to pay for family harmony. My father nodded slowly, already finished with the conversation, already done listening to anything I might say. My brother stood there relaxed, comfortable, confident in his victory, like he'd just delivered a sermon to devoted believers who had no questions. I was rigid, trembling, tears burning behind my eyes but refusing to fall because I knew tears would make me look unstable. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to explain, to fight back with words and passion and anger. But I saw it clearly in their faces. Anything I said now would sound like proof of his accusations. They'd already made their decision before I even arrived. I felt myself shrinking, not because I believed him, but because I saw how easily they'd chosen him over me, how quickly they'd sided with his narrative. I opened my mouth to speak, closed it, and then I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. He nodded, just once, quietly, the kind of nod that looks like surrender, the kind of nod that says, "I give up." My brother's expression changed slightly. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd surrendered completely. He had absolutely no idea what that silence actually meant. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't defeat. It was something far more dangerous. It was strategy. The door closed behind me as I left the house, and the sound echoed through the hallway like a judge's gavel. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands shaking against the steering wheel, replaying every moment of that conversation over and over. By the next morning, the shift was undeniable and immediate and complete. Family messages stopped including me. Group chats that I'd been part of for years suddenly had me removed. Plans were made without asking. Holiday invitations came without my name on them. When I reached out to my mother, her replies were polite, distant, cold as ice. My brother, meanwhile, became present, helpful, supportive, the golden child they preferred, the version of him they wanted to love. I replayed the confrontation obsessively in my mind, searching for where I'd gone wrong, what I'd done to deserve this treatment. Then I noticed something else. His story changed depending on who he was talking to. Dates moved around. Motives shifted. Details rearranged themselves. It wasn't dramatic enough for them to question him, but it was enough for me to notice. That was the first crack in his armor. I stopped asking why this happened. I started asking how. And more importantly, I started asking what I could do about it. I started planning. I began showing up to family events again, but different this time. Quiet. Agreeable. I smiled when spoken to and stayed silent when ignored. And I watched my brother control conversations, redirect sympathy, speak for others before they could speak for themselves. I noticed how often he said, "You know how she gets," when I wasn't even reacting, when I was just sitting there breathing quietly. I noticed how my parents relaxed when I stayed quiet, like silence proved him right all along. At night, I wrote things down in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Words, exact phrases and quotes. Contradictions between what he'd told different people at different times. I pulled old messages from my phone and saved them carefully to a folder on my computer. I wasn't building a case out of anger or revenge. I was building clarity, building truth, building facts. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood by them. I was trying to understand him. I was trying to figure out what made him lie so easily, what made him so willing to destroy me for control. And what I was learning terrified me, except he didn't know I was learning it yet. He had no idea I was documenting everything. My brother had mastered the art of being exactly what the family needed in any given moment. Responsible when it mattered. Charming when attention shifted. He became the interpreter of my silence, explaining it in ways that benefited him perfectly. "She needs space," he'd say at dinner. "She's sensitive right now. She's going through something and can't handle normal family dynamics." Each comment painted him as considerate and understanding, and me as fragile, broken, damaged beyond repair. What hurt most wasn't the lie itself. It was how eagerly it was accepted, how hungrily they consumed his version of me. No one questioned his narrative. No one asked me what I actually needed or wanted. I realized that favoritism didn't always look like praise. Sometimes it looked like protection. He was protected from scrutiny, from questions, from accountability. I was the cost of that protection, the sacrifice they made for his comfort. The more I faded into silence, the more he filled the space with his version of me. He underestimated my silence completely. He thought it meant confusion, weakness, defeat. He never considered that it could be patience. He never thought that silence could be a weapon. That assumption would become his biggest mistake. 3 weeks later, I was cleaning out old storage boxes at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon. Dusty boxes filled with memories I'd forgotten about. Behind outdated paperwork and tax returns from years ago, I found an envelope. My hands froze. Inside were printed emails, conversations I'd completely forgotten about. My brother asking me for help with a crisis, thanking me for being there for him, relying on me completely, saying he didn't know what he'd do without me. These emails directly contradicted everything he'd been telling everyone. That I was always unreasonable. That I'd never been there for him. That I was impossible to deal with. My hands trembled as I read them carefully, word by word. Not from fear. From recognition. This wasn't about memory or who remembered what. It was about narrative. He hadn't simply forgotten the truth. He'd deliberately replaced it, rewritten it, made himself the hero and me the villain. I didn't confront him. I photographed every single email carefully with perfect clarity. Put the originals back exactly where I'd found them. Walking out of that room, something shifted inside me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't going crazy. I was being systematically rewritten. And I finally had proof. I started asking neutral questions at family gatherings and dinners. Not accusations. Simple clarifications. When did that happen exactly? Who else was there that day? What year was that again? My brother answered smoothly each time, but differently depending on the question. He didn't notice because no one had ever challenged him before. I watched my parents glance at each other, confused for a split second, then dismissed the inconsistencies. He quickly filled the silence with confidence and authority. I stayed quiet. That silence made him talk more. Over-explain. Embellish. The lie grew heavier with every retelling, more complicated, more elaborate. I realized something powerful then. He needed me silent, but he also needed me present. My absence would raise questions. My presence, quiet and agreeable, made him careless and arrogant. So I stayed. Observant. I wasn't waiting for him to slip up accidentally. I was letting him hang himself with his own words, watching him dig deeper into his lies. There were nights I cried alone in my apartment, questioning whether any of this was worth it. Questioning whether proving the truth would actually heal anything or just create more damage. Every time I considered confronting him privately, I remembered that living room. How easily he'd twisted my pain into evidence against me. I understood then. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was calculated strategy. Confronting him without witnesses would only give him another story to tell them. Another version of me to sell, another narrative to control. So I swallowed the urge to react. Became precise. Clinical. I learned the rhythm of family conversations, when to speak and when to disappear. My parents mistook my composure for acceptance. My brother mistook it for defeat. Neither realized I was preparing something much stronger than an argument. I was preparing a moment that would change everything. And I was patient enough to wait for the right time. I never asked anyone to take my side. I didn't need to. I let them notice what I'd noticed. A cousin once asked quietly, "That's not how I remember it." I didn't respond, just met her eyes and nodded slightly. An aunt hesitated when my brother spoke for me, waiting for me to correct him. I didn't. The doubt grew on its own, spreading like water finding cracks. I shared nothing directly. I simply stopped covering for him when he made mistakes. When asked a direct question, I answered honestly, briefly, without emotion. No blame. No drama. Just truth delivered calmly. Truth has a way of lingering when it's spoken quietly. It echoes longer than anger ever could. I saw it in their expressions, the confusion, the discomfort. He was losing control of the room slowly, and he had no idea it was happening. The pedestal was cracking, one question at a time. My parents announced a family meeting. Something about future planning and important conversations. Everyone needed to be there. My brother looked pleased. This was his territory. He thrived in structured conversations where he could guide the narrative and control the flow. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but beneath it something steadier, something certain. I knew what I had now. Messages, timelines, contradictions documented with dates and times. Witnesses who were already doubting. That night, I laid everything out on my table. Printed copies of emails organized carefully. Screenshots documented and labeled. Notes with dates and exact quotes. Not enough to overwhelm. Just enough to let the truth speak for itself. I arranged them in order. A timeline of his lies, a map of his contradictions. Then I slept deeply for the first time in months. Not because I was confident they'd choose me, but because I finally knew I was standing on solid ground. We gathered in the same living room where it had all started. Same couch. Same framed photos on the walls meant to prove we loved each other. My brother took the floor immediately, summarizing concerns, positioning himself as the reasonable mediator. He spoke about me with practiced sympathy, like a lawyer presenting a case. I listened without interrupting. My parents nodded along. When he finished, there was a pause. The kind of pause that decides things. My father turned to me, hesitant. "Do you want to say anything?" he asked quietly. Took a breath. Just one. "Yes," I said. The room shifted. I didn't accuse. I didn't attack. I asked one simple question and placed one printed email on the table. The date was visible. The words unmistakable. My brother froze for half a second. It was almost invisible. Almost. I asked him to explain the message, my voice steady and calm despite the hurricane inside me. He laughed lightly, waved it off casually like it was nothing. "Taken out of context," he said, as if that explained everything. But I was prepared. I'd known he would say exactly this. So I placed another email beside it. Then another. Then another. 5 emails in total, each one contradicting something he'd said in this very room just minutes ago. Each one showing a different version of events. I stayed calm. My voice never rose. I let him talk himself into corners, watch him scramble for explanations that didn't fit together. My mother leaned forward, squinting at the pages, really reading them now instead of just listening to his voice. My father stopped nodding along. The room felt different, tense, alert, awake, like everyone had suddenly sobered up. My brother's confidence thinned visibly, replaced by irritation and something that looked like fear. He accused me of keeping records, of being obsessed, of being petty and vindictive and unable to move on. His voice got louder, more aggressive. I didn't respond. I just waited. I let him fill the silence with his own panic. Silence does something powerful when lies are exposed. Gives everyone space to think. Gives everyone time to process. And for the first time they were actually thinking. Actually questioning. Actually seeing. He tried to turn it back on me, claiming this proved my obsession, my inability to let things go, my petty need for revenge. His voice grew sharper, more desperate, more accusatory. He pointed at me like I was the villain in this story. I met his eyes steadily without blinking. "These are your words," I said quietly. Nothing more. I didn't need to say anything else. The emails spoke for themselves. My father asked a question then. Simple, direct, factual, the kind of question you can't dodge with anger or distraction. My brother hesitated. Gave an answer that didn't align with what he'd said 20 minutes earlier. The hesitation mattered. Everyone saw it register on their faces like a lie detector going off. The hesitation was the moment they realized he'd been lying all along. The image he'd built so carefully started to wobble. Not shattered. Not yet. But unstable in the way structures are just before collapse. Like a building with weak foundations finally feeling an earthquake. Felt no triumph. No sense of winning. Just relief. Deep, profound relief. I wasn't begging to be believed anymore. I was offering clarity, offering facts, offering truth. What they did with it was finally, completely their responsibility. Not mine anymore. My mother spoke next. Slowly. Carefully. She mentioned a moment she remembered differently than my brother had described it just an hour ago. Then another moment. Then another. Each recollection chipped away at his certainty like water wearing down stone, like persistent erosion wearing away at mountains. She was remembering things she'd buried for years, things she'd dismissed because he'd told her a different version. Now she was questioning those versions. He grew sharper, more defensive, his tone changing in ways that betrayed him. That shift, that defensive anger, told them everything my words never could. I watched my parents see him, really see him, for the first time in years. Not as the reliable one they'd always trusted. Not as the peacemaker they'd always relied on. But as someone controlling the story, rewriting history to suit himself, manipulating memory to benefit his narrative. He wasn't a hero. He was a strategist, liar, a manipulator. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't judgment or shame. It was realization. It was the moment they understood what had been happening all along. I felt something inside me loosen, release. I hadn't forced this moment. I'd allowed it to unfold naturally. I'd given them the evidence and let them draw their own conclusions. Cousin spoke up. Then an aunt. Small comments at first. Shared experiences. Patterns they'd noticed over the years but never voiced. My brother tried to interrupt, to regain control, but the rhythm had shifted. He wasn't leading anymore. He was reacting. Defending. Each new voice reframed the past slightly, and together they painted a picture he couldn't rewrite fast enough. I stayed still, hands folded, breathing steady. This wasn't revenge. This was truth catching up with him. The weight of years shifted in minutes. My brother looked at me then, not angry but stunned, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. Not broken, not defeated, not silent from shame, just patient, dangerously patient. My father asked him one final question. Simple, factual. Impossible to dodge with anger or manipulation. There was no dramatic build-up. Just a pause. Silence. My brother opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Nothing fit. The lie had grown too large, too complicated, too contradictory. His explanations didn't connect. He'd built a structure of deception that couldn't support itself anymore. It was collapsing under its own weight. The room waited. I felt the stillness press against my ribs. Everyone was waiting to see what he would say, how he would explain himself. He finally shrugged, deflecting, trying to change the subject to something safer. "This is getting personal," he said. "Let's move past this." It wasn't enough. That moment, that single moment of him giving up, of him unable to defend himself, that was when it broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The authority he'd held dissolved like smoke. Not because I took it, but because it was never earned. It was borrowed from my silence. It was built on my inability to defend myself. And I'd reclaimed that silence. Taken back my power. My mother turned to me, eyes wet with tears. Not angry tears. Sad tears. Tears of realization. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I answered honestly. Because I knew I wouldn't be heard then. That answer landed harder than any confrontation ever could. Harder than shouting. Harder than anger. My parents sat with it, understanding the cost of their certainty, the weight of believing without questioning, the damage caused by choosing the wrong person. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked away, shame washing over her face. I wasn't asking for apologies. I didn't need them. Being seen was enough. Being finally, truly heard was everything. The dynamic in that room had shifted permanently. My brother sat back, small, contained, diminished. Not defeated in a way that felt like loss to me. Exposed in a way that felt like truth. Like justice. Like balance. The playing field had leveled. The hierarchy had shifted. I was no longer the broken one. I was the one with the facts. The one with the evidence. The one who had been right all along. The meeting ended without grand resolution, but the damage was irreversible. Conversations changed. My brother was questioned. Asked to clarify. He was no longer assumed right. I was consulted. Included. Not out of guilt, out of caution. Out of recognition that they'd been wrong. The family recalibrated slowly, awkwardly, like learning to walk again. I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd won some battle, but because I no longer carried their misunderstanding alone. The truth had redistributed the weight. My silence had finally been heard. Later, a few days after the meeting, my brother approached me privately. Cornered me in the hallway after a family dinner. His tone was controlled, resentful, barely contained anger. He accused me of embarrassing him, of being cruel, of setting him up deliberately. He said I'd humiliated him in front of everyone. He said he couldn't believe I would do this to him. His eyes were hard. His voice was cold. I met his gaze without flinching or looking away. "You did that yourself," I said calmly. "I just showed them the truth." He searched my face for weakness, for doubt, for something to exploit. Found nothing. My composure was complete. My certainty was unshakable. I didn't threaten him. I didn't warn him. I didn't say anything else. I simply walked away. That terrified him more than any argument ever could. Because he understood then. I was no longer someone he could manipulate with words or silence or pity or anger. I was just gone. I had moved past him. He was no longer important enough to fight with. Family interactions settled into something new. Not perfect. Not completely healed. But honest. Authentic. Real. My brother spoke less at family gatherings. Listened more. He was questioned when he spoke. Asked for clarification. Challenged politely. The pedestal was gone. Completely dismantled. I didn't climb it. I didn't want it. I wanted balance. Respect. Space to exist without defense. Without constantly explaining myself. And I had it. The shift was subtle but real. Dinners were quieter. Conversations were gentler. There was less performance, less pretense. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting to prove my existence. I didn't feel like I had to constantly defend myself. Could just be myself. Could just exist. My parents started asking me questions instead of just listening to him. They asked about my life, my job, my feelings. They actually cared about my perspective. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but it was real change. Real progress. My brother noticed. He noticed how I was treated differently now. He noticed the respect they gave me. He noticed that his word wasn't law anymore. And watching him realize he'd lost his power was strangely satisfying. Not in a vengeful way, but in a way that felt like balance had finally been restored. No grand apology came from him. I didn't expect one. I knew he would never say he was sorry. He would never acknowledge what he'd done. That wasn't his nature. Healing didn't require his regret. It required my release. I stopped replaying the living room in my head. Stopped anticipating his moves, his stories, his next manipulation attempt. I stopped waiting for him to do something else. I stopped protecting myself against him. The tension I'd lived with for years finally eased in my chest, in my shoulders, in my sleep. I slept better, laughed more. I had my identity back not because anyone gave it to me but because I'd reclaimed it myself. I remembered who I was before he destroyed me. I remembered my strength. I remembered my worth. That was the real victory. Not winning the confrontation. Not proving my point. But getting myself back. I started doing things I'd abandoned while fighting for my life. I read again. I painted again. I spent time with friends who actually loved me. I stopped being defined by my family's dysfunction. I stopped letting his narrative control my life. Became free. My parents tried quietly to make amends. Not with speeches or grand gestures. With consistency. With listening. With asking instead of assuming. With admitting they were wrong. With treating me like I mattered. Mattered. Not because it erased the past. Nothing could do that. But because it changed the future. They became people who questioned narratives instead of accepting them blindly. People who asked both sides. People who listened to me. People who understood the cost of silence. People who understood what they'd done. It wasn't redemption. It was just better. It was moving forward. It was healing slowly. My mother called me one day and apologized. Really apologized. Not a quick sorry, but a real conversation about how she'd failed to protect me. How she'd chosen comfort over truth. How she regretted believing him without hearing me out. My father did the same. They couldn't undo the damage, but they could acknowledge it. And that acknowledgement was more healing than any victory could have been. It wasn't about them getting forgiveness. It was about me being seen and validated after years of being dismissed. My brother lost control of the narrative. That was everything. He still had his place in the family, but not his power. Not his immunity. Not the authority that came from my silence. Not the protection that came from me being broken. He learned that silence could belong to others too. That sometimes the quietest person in the room is the strongest. That patience is a weapon he could never understand. He lost the ability to rewrite history. He lost the trust he'd built on lies. He lost the pedestal that was built on my destruction. And most importantly, he lost me. He no longer had me as his silent victim. He tried to rebuild his image with the family, but they weren't naive anymore. They watched him carefully. They questioned his stories. They didn't accept his narrative without evidence. He became a person who had to earn trust instead of having it given freely. It was a position he'd never been in before. And watching him struggle with accountability was a lesson he desperately needed. He had to learn what consequences looked like. He had to learn that actions have repercussions. I gained something more valuable than vindication. I gained certainty. About myself. About my strength. About the fact that composure isn't weakness. It's leverage. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait. That truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. That standing still while others scramble is a form of power most people never discover. I gained the knowledge that I'm stronger than I thought. That I could survive being destroyed and still come back. That I could be patient when every instinct told me to fight. That I could be strategic when every emotion told me to react. I gained my power back. I gained clarity about who I am and what I deserve. I gained relationships that were based on truth instead of manipulation. I gained a family that actually listened to me. I gained the ability to trust my own judgment again. I gained freedom from the constant need to prove myself. And most importantly, I gained myself back. The version of me that knew my worth. The version of me that didn't need anyone's validation to exist. They once believed my brother's version of me because I was too broken to argue. I was shaking. I was silent. I was crying. To them, that meant I was guilty of everything he claimed. That meant I deserved to be treated that way. That meant I deserved to be destroyed. But now they know the truth. Not because I screamed it or fought for it, but because I let it stand on its own. And truth, when it's finally allowed to exist without interference, always rises. It always wins. It always surfaces. And I learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do. It's who you refuse to become. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become angry. I didn't become vengeful. Became strong. Became patient. Became intelligent. And that is the greatest victory of all. The greatest revenge. The greatest healing. 'Cause I took back my life. Not from him. From myself. I gave myself permission to heal. Permission to be strong. Permission to win. And every single day I remember that lesson. That silence can be a weapon. That patience is power. That truth always wins. And that I am worth fighting for. Even when no one else will fight for me, I will always fight for myself.